Ellsberg in the Pentagon Papers. Daniel Ellsberg is going to turn himself in 1971, 2 days before the famous New York Times v. U.S. decision comes down. So it's very prophetic. Right before the decision comes down, June 28, 1971, Daniel Ellsberg turns himself into the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts in Boston. What was Daniel Ellsberg guilty of? Well, he went ahead and took the Pentagon Papers and he passed it out to everybody. Pentagon Papers was classified information, but Daniel Ellsberg, who wrote the Pentagon Papers, and he himself says it was illegally classified because there was no reason for those papers to be classified, gave it to a bunch of intellectual think tanks and the New York Times, Washington Post, and he got Mike Gravel to read it into the Senate record. So the truth is out there. You can't stop the truth. Now, what are we going to do with Daniel Ellsberg? Well, Daniel Ellsberg turns himself in. The U.S. government is going to charge Daniel Ellsberg with the Espionage Act of 1917, along with other charges of theft and conspiracy, carrying a total max sentence of 115 years. So he's looking at 115 years in prison. The Espionage Act is notorious for fucking over anybody for saying anything, really, back in the 1900s, but also even still today with Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden. But it fucked over Eugene Debs, Charles Schneek, the Abrams people. So Schneek, Abrams, Robert Goldstein, they made a movie. You couldn't make a movie, you couldn't make a speech, you couldn't pass out literature, you couldn't pass out pieces of paper that question. You had to be, a huge patriot. You had to love the government, love the war. You couldn't say anything against it that could be interpreted as being against it or stopping the recruitment of it or a bunch of other stupid shit. Espionage Act is over a century years old. It's a total dog shit, shitty law. We don't want spies in the government, but it comes after publishers, and it comes after, Eugene Debs, so it can be used against political opponents. Eugene Debs ran against Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson is going to throw Eugene Debs in jail for making a speech, an anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio. He's going to be sentenced to jail for 10 years. He's going to get out early. Hardin's going to pardon him, but he's going to die shortly thereafter. So Woodrow Wilson used the Espionage Act of 1917 to kill Eugene Debs. So Daniel Ellsberg, he turns himself in. He's charged with the Espionage Act. He's looking at 115 years in prison. Right now you got, Julian Assange apparently is looking at 175 years in prison in America for the Espionage Act. So a lot of similarities to the cases, to the Pentagon paper and the Daniel Ellsberg and all of it. The Supreme Court, there's two trials, okay? So the New York Times versus U.S. 1971 Supreme Court case was just about whether or not you can publish classified information. If you had nothing to do with it, you're a third party, you're the New York Times, and somebody hands you a bunch of information, can you write a story about that? Yes, you can. So Julian Assange is not guilty. He's completely exonerated. He's completely acquitted. Go live your life, Julian Assange, because he's the publisher. It'd been Chelsea Manning would have been the Daniel Ellsberg of the WikiLeaks situation, collateral damage, which is the most notorious example of Julian Assange. And so, therefore, Julian Assange is the New York Times and Washington Post. Julian Assange is the publisher. And you might say, well, he's not really a publisher. He's not really a member of the press. He published information. That's what makes you a publisher, right? That's what makes you a member of the press, is if you find out information and you pass that information along. So he is absolutely is protected by it. So, yeah, I want to get into the Daniel Ellsberg side in the Pentagon paper. So he turns himself in because this is separate. What happens to Daniel Ellsberg matters, though, and it kind of, what happens to Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning went to jail and served, her time. And since Chelsea Manning went in and served her time, then that means, you can't have double jeopardy. You can't keep fucking with Chelsea Manning. But Chelsea Manning didn't have to serve time because Daniel Ellsberg, the charges against him are going to be dismissed. They're going to be dismissed, and it's going to be prosecutorial misconduct. Several shit happened. The FBI had tapped him, so there was domestic surveillance, illegal, information. You're going to say his information's illegal. What about your information? That's illegal too. All this information's illegal. I shouldn't be hearing about any of this. So they tapped his phone, and then they also, Nixon had his plumbers, the same Watergate plumbers, go into his psychiatrist, Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, and try to find some dirt on Daniel Ellsberg. Lewis Fielding, his office is going to get broken into by Nixon's plumber goons. And Nixon recorded him talking about it because he's a fucking psycho. He's such a weird fucking psycho. So he talked about breaking into the psychiatrist office of Daniel Ellsberg. Same plumbers that's going to sink him for Watergate. So, an incredible connection right there. Now, January 3rd, 1973 is when the trial is going to begin. So, Daniel Ellsberg's in jail. Is he on house arrest? What, for a year? For 2 years? And Daniel Ellsberg tried to argue that it was illegally classified, therefore it's okay. William Matthew Byrne, Jr. is the trial judge. And he ruled that he wasn't allowed to talk about why he did what he did. William Matthew Byrne, Jr. seems like he's going to be biased against Daniel Ellsberg because they said, they tried to say, well, he wants to give the reason why he gave the Pentagon Papers to, and the judge says you're not allowed to do that. That's illegal evidence. The rules of evidence says you can't do that. And then Daniel Ellsberg's lawyer was exasperated, and he says, oh my God, I have never heard of a case where a defendant was not permitted to tell the jury why he did what he did. And then William Matthew Byrne, Jr. said, well, you're hearing one right now. So it looked like that William Matthew Byrne, the judge in the Daniel Ellsberg case in 1973, was going to be biased against Daniel Ellsberg. Now, May 9th, 1973, the FBI is going to illegally wiretap Daniel Ellsberg without a court order, and the prosecution didn't share that information with the defense. So the FBI illegally wiretapped Ellsberg without a court order. They didn't share that information. So this is all a bunch of bullshit. What the fuck's going on, right? You got these breaking into the psychiatrist's office, this illegal wiretap due to the government misconduct and illegal evidence gathering, and with the defense by Leonard Boudin and Harvard Law School professor Charles Nesson. Judge William Matthew Byrne, Jr. dismissed all charges on May 11th, 1973, 2 days after it had been found out that the FBI had illegally wiretapped Daniel Ellsberg without a court order. Matthew William Byrne, Jr. is going to say the totality of the circumstances of this case, which I have only briefly sketched, offend a sense of justice. The bizarre events have incurably infected the prosecution of this case. Charges are dismissed. Daniel Ellsberg walks out a free man. So, 1969, Daniel Ellsberg copies the Pentagon Papers and passes it around. 1970, he asked George McGovern and J. William Fulbright, U.S. senators, to read the Pentagon Papers on the Senate floor, because apparently anything a senator reads on the U.S. Senate floor cannot be prosecuted. But George McGovern and J. William Fulbright were cowards, and they said no. New York Times Company v. U.S. gave the right to publish to the New York Times and the Washington Post too. 1971 case. It gave both of them could publish about the Pentagon Papers, and you can't even delay. How dare you? Why the fuck did you even stop their freedom to begin with, is what Hugo Black says. On June 29th, 1971, U.S. Senator Mike Gravel of Alaska entered 4,100 pages of the Pentagon Papers into the record of his subcommittee on public buildings and grounds. So he had some subcommittee that he was in charge of, public buildings and grounds, and he was like, fuck it. We're going to read the Pentagon Papers into this subcommittee. And he did. And he did. And there you go. That's Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. So Hugo Black, he said, every moment's continuance of the injunctions against these newspapers amounts to a flagrant, indefensible, and continuing violation of the First Amendment. Never should publications be enjoined. You cannot halt the publication of current news of vital importance to the people of this country. That's Hugo Black. That's a Supreme Court justice. That's an opinion saying we need, you know what, you need to get a move on. And then Judge Gerthine, he says that the security of a nation does not stop at the ramparts alone. The government must suffer a cantankerous, obstinate, and ubiquitous press, and it must be suffered by those in authority to protect America's culture of freedom, the freedom of expression, the public of the right of the people to know, the freedom of the press, freedom of speech. The government must suffer a cantankerous, obstinate, ubiquitous press. No, you cannot stop the press. You cannot stop Julian Assange from publishing. For every moment that you continue, the injunction of Julian Assange amounts to a flagrant, indefensible, and continuing violation of the First Amendment. Never should Julian Assange have been arrested. Never should his publications have been enjoined to begin with. You can't halt the publication of current news of vital importance to the people of this country. So this, wasn't just the collateral damage. It was the Podesta emails. It was Peru. It was Guantanamo Bay. It was CIA. It was a lot of different other countries. There was a lot of shit that was fucking happening. What are those other papers? Panama Papers. So WikiLeaks has been doing a great service for the entire goddamn world. And according to Hugo Black and Judge Gerfing, use their words, make sense. The 1971 Pentagon Papers Supreme Court case says that Julian Assange is free and clear, exonerated. Nothing Julian Assange does or did amounts to any kind of crime whatsoever. He's a journalist, and he wants to publish information, and so therefore, in order to get the information, he's like, hey, you got that information? That's not him being a spy. He's a publisher, and the person that gave him the information knows that he's a publisher. So he's not giving it to a state or, a government agency of any kind. He's giving it to a publisher, a person who is, part of the New York Times, freelance publisher, a freelance citizen journalist, which is good for everybody. That's how every American should look at the First Amendment, that you have a right to be a member of the press, so you don't just have the right to speak, but you have a right to publish. You have a right to, write about the information and about what you observe. You're allowed to write, publish, and speak about all these things. So therefore, you are a member of the press. You have the right for, religion, assembly, petition, but definitely freedom of speech and the right of the press. The right of the press. So, yeah, any system of prior restraint went to Hugo Black's court, bearing a heavy presumption against its constitutional validity. It was up to the government to show the burden, a heavy burden, of showing justification for the imposition of a prior restraint. National security. Okay, Nixon, you want to say that New York Times is threatening national security? How? How is the New York Times threatening national security? By publishing Pentagon Papers, a report about the past involvement of American presidents in the Vietnam War. It's history. It's already a history. It's information the government has about itself. Why can't the people know this? What goddamn national security was fucking threatened? If they want to try to say, well, we're important, powerful people, and if something bad happens to us, and then that means it's bad for the country. No, perhaps if you're a corrupt piece of shit, you shouldn't be in a seat of power. If you're a corrupt piece of shit, a corrupt criminal piece of shit, you shouldn't be in the seat of power. So the government's embarrassed. The government sees the truth as a threat, and it's just they're telling on themselves. So this is a total First Amendment, free speech case, and it's ridiculous. So free Julian Assange and bring Edward Snowden back home and quit fucking with Chelsea Manning for goddamn sake, motherfuckers. These guys are heroes. We should have statues of these men all over the place. These are good men. How come America doesn't embrace good men? JFK, RFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, so many fucking people come, Gandhi, so many people have come and said, hey, America, let's be brothers and sisters, and let's have a peaceful and loving, community. And then, bam, right through their fucking head. And then we're not even going to vote for Bernie Sanders, and now we're not even going to defend good men that did good shit for us. They died for us. Talk about a bunch of Christians. You don't realize a man died for your sins? Literally. Edward Snowden and Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning, they all died for the sins of America. And they were martyred, and they're being bullied and shitted on during their lifetimes. And for every moment that they, that this injustice isn't reversed, for every moment it goes on. It's indefensible, flagrantly indefensible, and it's a continuing violation of the First Amendment. So, yeah, free Julian Assange now. Peace.